All right, well, I think we're going to get started because I want to be able to use all the time we have, every minute of it. And we will let people trickle in. Just a bit of housekeeping. We will have lunch available afterwards. You'll be able to pick it up on your way out?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today. My name is Grace Meng. I'm the Executive Director of the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Levy Fellow Talk. Through the generosity of Margaret Levy, we're here since 2018. We have honored 2 attorneys every year with the Levy Fellowship. We select attorneys who are leaders in advocating for social justice and transformative change, who are thinking in innovative, creative ways about how to create a new and better world. Each semester, the Levy Fellow gives a public lecture, such as the one we have today, a more intimate talk about their career path for students alone, and offers additional opportunities for students to learn from the work of our fellows. But we will be having those events tomorrow. I remember as a law student sitting in torts or contracts, wondering what kind of life I might have as an attorney, and then finally meeting attorneys whose life work showed me models I really want to emulate. So the Levy Fellowship is a cornerstone of our program's mission to inspire, train, and support our students to become the next generation of public interest leaders. Today, I have the great honor of introducing Purvi Shah, our 2024 Fall Levy Fellow. Purvi is a movement lawyer, civil rights litigator, policy advocate, and I think very important for this audience, an educator in the truest sense of the word. Before becoming an attorney, Purvi was a community organizer with youth in Miami, students in India, and families of incarcerated youth in California. She co-founded the Community Justice Project of Florida Legal Services. And an interview with Purvi about this work as a movement lawyer has been a part of the PILP 1L curriculum for some time now. She was the founding director at the Bertha Justice Institute at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she trained thousands of lawyers on movement lawyering and helped build a global network in 16 countries. In the aftermath of the Ferguson uprisings, Purvi co-founded Law for Black Lives, a national network of 3,500 lawyers committed to using law to build a world where Black lives matter. In her current role, she is the founder and executive director of Movement Law Lab, which brings the power of lawyers to social justice movements. Now, I was thinking about looking at all the examples of the work that Movement Law Lab does, and I was really struck by this one, that the organization is working with the Right to the City Alliance to activate lawyers to stop evictions and support tenant power, including to the Level Up Housing Justice Fellowship, where an attorney and organizer paired together in the U.S. South were awarded fellowships to work on housing crises faced by low-income residents and communities of color. To me, that seems to so epitomize how you think about the work that attorneys should do. It is literally just over a week since Donald Trump became president-elect, 8 years after an administration that Purvi and others in this room remember all too well. Purvi was incredibly busy before the election, has been incredibly busy since, fielding calls and questions about where we go from here. She said to me yesterday that she was looking forward to the visit because it would be a moment for her to pause and collect her thoughts and articulate a lot of what she has been thinking about over the past week. Given this moment, how raw so many of us feel, we decided that a polished lecture wasn't the way to go. So I will be in conversation with Purvi today, asking her the key questions that we all have, and inviting all of you to ask her questions as well. We are lucky to have Purvi with us today and tomorrow, speaking with her years of experience and expertise, and also speaking from her heart. Please join me in welcoming Purvi Shah.
Great, so before we start, can I hold the room on something? Okay, this is gonna date me, so forgive it, and maybe you won't know the references, but I kind of want to know, I have like 2 songs in my head, and I want to know which one best represents your current state of being. And some of you, might, I don't know, what's old is new again. So how many people are kind of in, the 2 options are Fight the Power, right? We know Fight the Power, okay, some people are like, okay, great, wow. And the other option, this one might be, is Everybody Hurts by REM. So who's in the Everybody Hurts camp of REM? Okay, that's the vibes. And how many people are in the Fight the Power space?
Can we be in both?
Can we do both?
Well, you tell, I guess, but if you're leaning more in one direction, let me know, and then maybe I'll do it both. A yes and. So, Fight the Power, come on. If you're fighting the power, loud and proud, please. Okay, Fight the Power, definitely not most of the room. That's okay. And who's in the, maybe I'm figuring it out. I don't know what song it tells us I'm figuring it out. Okay.
Maybe if I can add, a few of us are international
Okay,
attorneys.
great.
So as a foreigner,
Yes.
how should we appreciate the whole situation? The first thing is being respectful and listening to the reaction of our fellow students, but
Okay.
it's difficult to build our own opinion on the situation.
Well, and what's happening is certainly not it's only happening inside the United States. So we can bring that into the conversation. Okay, so we're mostly everybody is hurting. Okay, that's good. Good to know. Sorry, go ahead.
So, to start us all kind of on the same page, we are hurting and fighting the power, but what can you tell us about what the outcome of this year's election tells us about the state of our country?
Big question.
Big question.
Easy question,
We'll start with
right?
the easy questions.
In 3 minutes or less.
Yeah, no, not 3 minutes. Well, first I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I was really thinking about the value of having a space where, everyone's processing. We're all trying to figure out what this moment means. So I feel really grateful to be here and to be in community, to contemplate, to ask questions, maybe to wrestle with things that are hard. So that's kind of first. Second, it seems like many of us are feeling, some range of hurt. We are maybe discouraged, grieving, frustrated, angry, rage, numb, disconnected. I've certainly felt all of those things in this period. And so this is a hard and a dark time. And I don't want to underscore that might be just what we're all feeling. So I definitely feel like this is, I will try to be sober about my assessment about things. I'm not going to this isn't going to be like a transition you from everybody hurts to fight the power, but maybe it will do that in some ways. But I guess I just want to name and hold inside the container of this conversation that this is very hard. And there are going to be very real impacts for many people, maybe for each of you, maybe for people you love, maybe for things that are really important to you. So I just want to start off before we get into an analytical place, just naming that and holding that. And I think that's important because I don't think there's a way through this moment without feeling. And so this is my third caveat before I answer the question, which is I'm not going to give you a hot take. I don't believe, I think anyone who tells you this is what absolutely this means, or this is absolutely what we did wrong, or this is absolutely the way forward, I actually don't think you should trust that. I think that you should be skeptical of that. So I have some thoughts. I have been working on this for many years. There are some things that don't feel surprising, but I don't have all the answers. And I don't think you should trust me if I came up here and I said, this is what this all means. So I'm also processing. That's my caveat to give you in this moment. And this is a small room. So I also at some point, Grace and I have some questions that we think are going to resonate for you all, but let's just talk. That's the point of this, right? Okay, so what does this moment mean? What does this mean? What does this moment mean? Okay, well, I think part of the way to understand what this moment means, you have to look at it in a longer horizon of time. We did not arrive here a week ago. We have been in the process, right? We've been in a process that has led up to this moment, which I think is really important. In moments of great crisis or stress or terror or, worry, it's very easy to kind of just look right here, right? And I think it's important for us to take a breath, feel that grief and kind of try to locate ourselves on a longer timeline of history. I think what we are experiencing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about guess what I've tried to understand the election results meaning is, I think in some ways we have been in a protracted period of crisis, right? We have been in an economic crisis, right? Ups and downs, but still the COVID moment exposed the kind of precarity of our economy, right? We saw millions, 30 million people pushed into the precarity of an eviction. We saw millions of workers facing job loss or job insecurity, right? We have seen millions of people facing the crisis of a lack of health care. So we've been in a protracted moment of crisis. I think what we're finding in this moment is that a broader swath of Americans are understanding what poor and marginalized people have always understood, that the systems and structures of this country are corrupted and they're not working for everyday people. And for most of us, everyday people is sort of like a term that maybe doesn't have a ton of meaning, but I mean for wide sectors of our society, systems of this country aren't working. Now, in that crisis, which we can track, maybe to a variety of moments, a particular crisis, I think, of the current moment that comes out of the sort of 70s, right? And the sort of market-based neoliberalism, the kind of idea that the way we're going to address the problems of our society are through market-based solutions. And so we've been in a long period in which that's kind of been, whether you're Republican or Democrat, there's been a sort of belief in the sort of private sector, corporate solution. So we've kind of been in a period in which I would say the neoliberal solution to our problems has kind of been what we've been operating under. So I think we're in a crisis that is much longer than this current moment. But inside crisis, there's an opportunity. We're contending. So what we're seeing is, in some way, there's a contention for the future. And I think there are multiple sectors that are trying to contend for the future. So what you see in some ways is that you had a proto-fascist or an authoritarian bloc that was saying, well, we have the answer. We actually can tell you. It's immigrants that are creating the financial pressures. It's it's wokeism. They're answering the question of the crisis. They're saying the pain you're feeling is because of this, and we have a solution. And it is make America great again, or it is all sorts of framings and articulations. But in some ways, there's a contention for the future happening from that sector. You also have a sort of reassertion of the neoliberal paradigm in which people are saying, well, this is the answer. Double down on the rule of law and business as usual and the structures and there is a sort of another narrative. Maybe both are unappealing to a lot of people in this room, perhaps to a lot of people in our country, as I think the election results tell us maybe a couple of different stories. But I think that the reality is that in crisis, there's opportunity. And in that opportunity, there are different forces that come forward to say, this is how we make meaning. And so I think in some ways we're seeing that the MAGA bloc, whatever, and I use that not as a pejorative, it is actually a social force of various people that have come together in alignment, disagree on some things, but agree around wanting to be in control of governing institutions and contending for the future. And so I think what we see in this election results is whether or not, whatever it is, the narrative that was put forward spoke to some people's needs, and it was compelling. And I think what we're seeing in some ways is the death knell for neoliberalism, that the sort of corporate, the collusion between Democrats and corporations, and the sort of inside all of the reality of disinformation, and truth doesn't totally matter, as we all know. But I think in terms of narratives, I think that's what we're seeing, is people are saying, this speaks to my needs. I think that I don't have a pejorative view of people that maybe made a decision that I think is actually not in their personal interest. I think maybe we're failing in some ways to meet people's material needs, right? So I think I just want to name that we're in a contention for the future. Certain forces are speaking to people's needs. Now, where does that leave us in some ways? Well, the reality is that authoritarianism cannot provide for the material needs of people. So regardless of the ability to speak to people's pain, the actual program doesn't meet working class people's needs. It won't improve your day-to-day life. A market bump for X billionaires does not improve the lives of everyday people. So I think when we locate ourselves, yes, this is a resounding loss. And there are many progressives like myself, and I'm speaking from a personal place, not from an institutional one, but there are many progressives like myself that had made a calculation that the true left or progressives didn't have enough power. We didn't have enough power to offer a third way between these two terrible choices. So we organized for the conditions that we wanted to fight in, which is in some ways building an alliance with neoliberals to try to defeat authoritarians. We weren't able to do that. And that is the situation that we're in. So I think there's a lot more to say about kind of, and I don't know that all of it is important in this moment to dissect, and there will be lots of spaces, but I guess I just want to say, like, take a step back, and what feels like is a loss of, like, how could people, is a sign of structural problems and structural collapse. And that is something for us to hold on to. That resonates even with us in some ways. We don't feel like society is working for everyone. I think that the question is that there will be another crisis because an authoritarian agenda will not provide for the people. The question is, will we be ready with an alternative? Will we be able to say this actually can provide for the people? This actually does meet the material needs of people. And will we have the power to actually effectuate that agenda? And I think these are the two questions that if you're trying to make sense of this moment, we have to kind of ground back into those questions, right? How do we help? How do we all make meaning of this moment? How do we continue to build a bigger we? The more we fracture and the more there's shame and blame and pointing the fingers and be like, y'all messed up and y'all messed up, I think that is not going to serve where we need to go. So I'll talk more about what I think particularly lawyers and law students need to be doing. But I think in terms of understanding it, it's like there was a rupture. It's like there's a rupture in the system that creates an opening and different forces are vying for the future. And I think that really has helped me be very politically clear about what's happening, right? And if we don't understand that contention is going on and we're not speaking to what that future could be, we're missing the kind of opportunity of which in some ways, it's not just the opportunity. I think progressive movements are trying to speak to it, but we also don't have the power yet, and I don't think we're speaking enough to people's needs. What else do I want to say? Let's see. I think I do want to bring it back to like contextualizing this, so contextualizing it in a horizon of time and an agenda that is much longer than this election. Contextualizing it also in a historical and international context. So while what feels like happening here is very exceptional, it's part of a trend of strong men authoritarian leaders in other parts of the world, Argentina, the Netherlands, right? So in similar contexts of working class folks who you think's interests are not aligned with an authoritarian agenda, aligning in some way or voting that way. And I think part of that is because there's two things. I think there's an authoritarian populism going on that is actually creating some kinds of concessions for people's needs. It's not a full agenda, but it's strategic. And that's kind of something I also want to say. I actually think the right is very good at power. They are very strategic about power. It is, and I don't say that to venerate it. I say sometimes I think progressives struggle to be very concentrated on the question of power. I think we can get sometimes lost and realize that like we're kind of swallowing in the Kool-Aid a little bit and not actually like having a sort of unbridled or a sober look at the chessboard. So all that to say, let's contextualize it in a bigger moment in history. Let's look at what's happening around the world. And this is not the only moment. Like we are in a country that had presidents that supported the enslavement of people, that supported genocide of Native people. Like this is a new moment, and it is not a new moment. And I think in that sense, there is also a path forward let's talk about that. I don't know all the answers, but I also don't feel that this is a terrain that our people haven't walked in some kind of way. So I know it's hard. I know it's disheartening. I know we're grieving. Maybe it's not a surprise, and even then it's still hard. But I think that like it's kind of like a moment to breathe, try to locate yourself in a bigger timeline, feel some feelings, right? Like, and I think Audre Lorde, and I saw this on social media somewhere, but like Audre Lorde said something that they're like feelings are the pathway to knowledge. And I don't think we can like sublimate ourselves into a sharper stance. We're gonna have to feel, but maybe feel also a bit in motion. This is also not a time for like paralysis. Like shit's gonna go down and it's gonna take all of us. So to me, it's like, how do you socialize your grief? How do you have that in collectives? This is not a singular, like we're not gonna make it through this and find our footing if you are in the individual ruggedness that America puts us in, where you're like, I am isolating, I am adamant, I feel very alone, I am scared, and I'm gonna just deal with that on my own. So finding ways, like I had a teammate at my organization who's said this concept, which has been very beautiful to me, like how do we socialize our grief? How do we actually collectivize the pain? I think when you do that, it's kind of like if I'm really down and I can't find my footing because this shit's real, like my family, my partner, myself, like deportations, trans folks, queer folks, like kids, healthcare, like it is not a drill what's going to happen, right? But if you're in a collective, if you're a part of an organization, there is a way where like if you need to take a beat, there are other people that are moving the agenda forward and moving the strategy forward. So let's talk about what that strategy is, but that's kind of how I would start to make meaning of what this moment means.
So one thing that we talk about a lot, with the students here, I think the left has, like even before this moment, been thinking like, oh, is law like the right tool? Like what is, I think a healthy skepticism of kind of lawyers and movements and what role lawyers should play. And I'd love to hear from you sort of, why should we be glad to be lawyers or law students in this moment? Like what is a legal community? What role can we play?
Well, before I go to the role, I kind of also want to name a little bit like what's happening in law. Because law is not like a bystander to this moment. Law has been central to the rights agenda, right? So if we think about the 50-year, 40-plus year agenda to basically capture law and the judiciary for the interests of essentially an agenda that is not about equality or freedom or reducing exploitation, right? Think about the conservative legal movement has been very strategically, persistently, doggedly moving an agenda, building the jurisprudence ideas, building the networks and the associations, putting people into places of power, right? If you look, I don't know how many people have been reading some of the exposés going on about the Supreme Court, about the conservative legal movement, FedSoc. If you haven't read those, read them. That's our world. So when we sit there, right, and our people and our communities are dealing with the tip of the iceberg, which is a Supreme Court that passes, the Chevron case, or immunity for the president, or Roe v. Wade, right? Or, it's like when you sit at that level, people assume the conditions of law are they're just like the water we're swimming in, right? It's like we're told courts are rational, neutral, fair. So all these things are happening and communities are now that's just the reality of the situation, which it is. But the story, if you go under the iceberg, is a little bit more complicated. There has been a very strategic organizing campaign in law, right? Leonard Leo says the strategy in law is the blueprint for everything else that the right wants to do. The success in law is the blueprint for what they want to do in culture, in narrative, in education, right? People know who Leonard Leo is? Yeah, okay. So Teneo, the new organization that Leonard Leo has started, is essentially the FedSoc for everything, right? And this isn't to demon, I just think the infrastructure, I'm an infrastructure nerd. That's what I do. I build layers of infrastructure for radical progressive movements. When you look at the infrastructure of the conservative legal movement, I wrote it down because I'm just like we need to talk about this as a progressive legal sector. You have the outcomes, right, which are all the things but underneath that, you have movement lawyers on the conservative side. They are the Pacific Legal Foundation. They are working on economic freedom. They are getting rid of affirmative action. There are movement lawyers. They're moving a conservative movement agenda. You have movement policy engines for the conservative sector, right? You have ALEC, you have the Heritage Foundation. If you don't know what Project 2025 or Project Esther is, you're not paying attention. So you gotta look those things up. But to me, power isn't just the ability to achieve outcomes. Power is the ability to set the agenda. Power is the ability to determine worldview. And we are living in the rights worldview, right? Originalism, now that they have an activist court, they're like, we're done with that shit, right? I think there is something we are missing about the power game that's being levied inside the law. And I think that is very important, that battle for ideas, networks, and pipelines. We all know now the transaction that was made between Leonard Leo and Trump 1.0. These are the judges that we want to be put into the judiciary. Now we're living in the reality of a trifecta and a captured Supreme Court, many trifectas in the states as well. That didn't happen overnight. That was a 50-year agenda that now we are downstream from. So I think there's no way to understand what the role of the progressive legal sector is if you don't understand how we arrived at this moment. And I think some of this is there's dark power, there is money. I mean, if you are Court Accountability, if you guys don't know that organization, I think they are some of the best thinkers, and there's investigative journalists, right? Everything that we've been learning about the lack of ethics, the lack of following ethics in the judiciary. This is very important because now we're at the tip of the iceberg. But if you want to unravel that, we're going to have to think about it. So my big insight is we're being out-organized in the law. Being out-organized. Not those ideas are better. And I'll be damned if we get out-organized. We should be a little bit more of a forward stance of how do we want to think. And because it's easy to work at the individual level and you're saying, okay, what's the case I can do? Where can I be in position? You're losing the chessboard if that's the only question that you're asking. You need to ask, what is our sector doing? What are the ideas that we're moving? What are the networks and pipelines, right? So to me, I'm there's an organizing opportunity here, and we are being out-organized on the terrain of law. And when you get out-organized on the terrain of law, that creates a bunch of outcomes that are very real in people's lives, as we are all living and seeing, right? So I don't think there is a way for us to move forward and figure out that has to be included, and that's not everybody's work. And I'm going to say, you will, this is a get-in where you can fit in moment, but I just don't want us to start narrowing into tactics and not understanding the strategy. Someone said, my friend Maurice Mitchell of the Working Families Party said, if you find yourself just moving and not really understanding what strategy you're moving towards, you are inside someone else's strategy. So if we find ourselves in a flurry of action without actually knowing how we're going to get to a point where when that contention opportunity comes, we can contend for a different future, we are in someone else's strategy. We are in a drama that Stephen Miller wrote. We're progressive A and progressive B. You understand what I'm saying? So this is a moment for clear eyes. Understand how the game is rigged. We're also in a moment in which when I've been in endless call preparing for a contested election, hundreds and hundreds of progressive lawyers. 2 days after the election, everyone was sending a congratulatory email to everyone being we did it. There was no election interference. And it's time to wrap up and put it all away. We're missing the chessboard. We're missing the chessboard, right? So to me, I'm the right talks and language of originalism and we can't have an active, and it is just a play. It is just a play. Fidelity to ideas, and that is something we know, sitting here reading the cases. There's no inherent self-effectuating justice that comes from law. We know that from looking at the history, looking at the way even though we learn it sometimes in very legal-centric ways, if you know history, you know this is all happening in a more dynamic field of play, in which law is doing something, but there are many other things happening in society as well. So to me, if you want to know what you can be doing, and I'm going to get a little bit more concrete about that, you have to see the chessboard for what it is. And you are entering the field, but we will need you, because I don't think the progressive institutions that exist are completely, and there's a much longer conversation we can have about why we aren't agile. We're not ready to make drastic changes, which I don't think there is a way to win back the institutions, to have governing power. Like now we are in a rigged game, and we don't have as much power. So, and we have an authoritarian that is putting into cabinet positions, and gonna move, they have been very clear and transparent actually about the agenda. Believe it. So if you're sitting here being like, it's gonna be that bad. Stephen Miller has a plan. Matt Gaetz, it's just gonna be really tough. And I say that not to be demobilizing, but to be like, if we don't understand the conditions we're in, we cannot figure out a way to be useful. We don't want to just be cogs in somebody else's strategy. We need to have our own strategy. So that's depressing. But it's not, because if you start to understand the stance you need to be in, then you can get yourself into that place and figure out how now from this place, sober about power, understanding that the political terrain is different than we thought it was, aware that our sector has maybe been a little bit lost in the sauce on the truth, or maybe even, I was saying this earlier with some of the faculty that if my pet peeve also, not pet peeve, but my assessment is the progressive legal sector, when you think of anything from direct services work, so legal services or impact litigation shops, our primary charge has been, in some ways, to protect the wins of the past. We are trying to make sure that whether it's an entitlement, you have a right to counsel in particular arenas, we want to make that real for people. Very noble, very important. But when it comes, or the civil rights victories, the Voting Rights Act, we are trying to, right? Great, good work, noble work. We are losing on all of those terrains. So if our only tip of the spear is to try to protect what we've won in the past, we are missing what is happening. That doesn't mean we don't need people to do that work. It just means that is necessary, not sufficient. There has to be additional strategic approaches to this moment. Yeah. Okay. So what actually can we do? Okay. Well, I feel like I want to talk a little bit about that in a few different dimensions. So I think there's a what. We are analytical people. If you are committed to public interest, you're probably a doer. You're give me the task and I will do it. So we're a what? Tell me, what's the case? Where do I go? What's yeah, I'll give you some of that. But I think what matters more, not more, what matters, yeah, maybe more, is the how that we do it. I don't think it's enough to do a what. There has to be a how. And the how, I mean, both ways of being, how do we actually get work done? And that's also at the core of movement lawyering. At movement lawyering, we are very invested in a how. Winning things without a way that is increasing power is not a win in my eyes. Doesn't mean in this moment I wouldn't want to do some of those things, but it means again, the chessboard is about power. So if we're not working on the arena of power, we won't be in a different situation. So on the what? Well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Name some things you think are going to happen in this time period. Just popcorn them out. Y'all know you've been thinking about it. You've been depressed, drinking your wine, your coffee, and your water at the same time.
They're going to give Trump a third term. The Supreme Court's going to rule that he can run again.
Okay, so there's going to be some kind of massive change in those. Okay, what else? What's the kind of things that are going to happen to everyday people?
Mass deportation.
Mass deportations. What else?
Massive deregulation, including of environment.
And so that's going to trickle down into like neighborhoods. People are going to like real shit is going to happen in neighborhoods. What else?
Trump is going to pardon white supremacists, do violent things.
Great. So that there people are going to feel emboldened. There's going to be more political violence, more maybe tension. What else?
Justice Thomas is going to resign, and he's going to be replaced by a copycat who's like 40.
Say that again?
Justice Thomas is going to resign, and he's going to be replaced by somebody who's exactly like him, but 40 years old.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I haven't heard
You
that
haven't
one.
thought of
But hey,
it?
I think cost of living will go up.
cost of living will go up. What else? What about healthcare? What's going to happen to healthcare?
Well, what I was gonna say is they're talking about ending free school lunch and like ending the Department of Education
Yeah,
and Title I funding for
Yeah.
local schools
yeah.
and doing this crazy scheme to make it like instead of a 40-hour work week, it's a 160-hour month, so that you don't get overtime at the end of the month. Like they could just work you for 3 weeks and then at the end they just say like you're out of hours. It's all steps that they're thinking. They're Project 2025 stuff.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is some really, and how many, this is not like small numbers of people that are going to be experiencing some of these things. So I do think there is going to be a big piece of our work in this time that is just dealing with trying to hold the stem against suffering of our people. So people are getting deported. Yeah, we're going to need to do massive amounts of mass defense of people. I don't know how much of that we're going to be able to stop, but we are going to have to stress test the systems, the administrative and legal systems, to try to prevent as much of that as we can. I think there are going to be all sorts of ways that people's day-to-day lives are going to be impacted. So I think that is an arena of work. And I think that is important work. I think sometimes when we think about social justice work or social justice lawyering, we were talking about this earlier today, that like there somehow is some hierarchy of like the work that's valuable. It's like, oh, well, the drugs are not that work. I want to do the big case. And I'm here to be like, let me just burst that bubble for you. There is, I started out as a direct services lawyer. I think there is no better way to understand the contour of the systems than to be actually representing people day in and day out of those systems. Doesn't mean it's my hill to die on to do that work for my entire life. I didn't. And I think there are strategic reasons to choose other arenas to play in. But that work is important. That work saves lives. That work helps people join and, to find other people potentially and organize and stay in community and connected. So I think there is an enormous, if that is the kind of work that speaks to you, you should do that work. That work is very important. I think there are a couple of other things that we're going to need to do. So you started to bring up Project 2025. There have been, thankfully, hundreds of lawyers that have been looking at Project 2020, progressive lawyers have been looking at Project 2025, dissecting the threats, and figuring out what might be litigation-oriented strategies. But, field of play, how much do we think litigation only is going to stop Project 2025? Probably not, right? So it doesn't mean we're not to do it. Like, I think the orientation I want you to get in is stress test the system. You've got to actually hold feet to the fire in every place that you can. So if y'all are still in law school, but if you're interning places, you're looking for jobs, you're graduating, I would say a very important arena of work. We've got to hold the fire as much as we can to Project 2025. Try to, might be death by 1,000 cuts, might be looking at states and figuring out how can states hold the line. The authoritarian agenda cannot be implemented by a lone person at the top. Authoritarian agendas move because there are thousands of people that implement the agenda. So we need to make that a real thing. How can you wedge people? We as lawyers can't be taking an oath and then being like, let's be doing anti-democratic work. So I think we're going to have to figure out how to jostle a little, how to agitate, organize, and fight, all the things. Maybe a couple of other points. I think we are going to, and this is probably the most important thing, protecting and flanking social movements. At some point, the authoritarian agenda is only really able to be stopped by an activated civil society. If you read all the literature on electoral autocracies, if you look at any of the slides into authoritarianism, it was mass non-cooperation by organized people that ultimately breaks the authoritarian agenda. Mass strikes. mass non-cooperation. We're not there yet. But to me, the question is, you must be following the kind of crackdowns that we're expecting on civil society. They've been very transparent about that. We've already seen congressional oversight hearings, IRS audits are coming. The bill that just didn't pass in the House, which guaranteed will pass at another point or get passed in the states, right? This idea of the terrorism framework. We have been here before. So there is going to be an enormous amount of pressure, and it's not just going to the left flank of social movements. If you look at what the Texas AG is doing, it's going to social service providers. It's going to go to military generals. It is going to be very wide, and the idea is quash all those who dissent. So it is going to be, our sector has a very important role to play in criminal defense of people who are going to be, we are seeing Cop City, we're seeing RICO charges being levied, we are seeing a whole new ballgame of threats to the right to protest. So we are going to, if I don't know how to do a RICO case, how many progressive lawyers know how to do a RICO case, right? So we're going to have to learn new skills, and we're going to have to get into position to represent, and there's going to be civil sides of it, and there are going to be criminal sides of it, and they need us to have their backs. So anywhere you work, anywhere you live, find organizations and figure out how to have their back. What is the way that you can safeguard some of that in advance? What are the ways people can prepare for that? And then what are the ways that when the shit hits the fan, people are not twisting on their own? We have been through this before. COINTELPRO, HUAC, this is not new. But this is new for us, new for, I think, the scale that our generation would experience. There were valiant lawyers that stood with movements that were being persecuted at various points. And that is not new, it's just different now, right? Criminalization of movements, criminalization of people is also just another form. So to me, I think there is incredible importance to the work of flanking, because in some ways, as much as we've done the voting rights protection, contested, all that stuff, at some point, our hope is in the people. And so our ability to be courageous and to disobey, in authoritarianism, you talk a lot about this idea of anticipatory obedience. Conceding to the authoritarian agenda before really, we're scared, there's a chilling effect. That we have to have the courage to not do. And I will tell you, I've been in call after call after call. 150,000 people were on a call last week. I've been in movement spaces with hundreds of organizations that are getting ready to resist, to disobey. And they need us to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and be courageous and not worry about our elite privilege or the law firm jobs that you might get or not. Although the whole chessboard is different now. There are law firms that are willing to do some of this work too right now. So smaller sector, conflicts of interest at times, but still, I think there's a much broader we than I think we've ever, it's an opportunity. There's a broader we. There are a lot of people. So those are some things I think working around. Okay, so some short-term things. Last thing I'll say on this is long-term strategies. If we all flurry into rapid response only, we will not have our 50-year agenda. So some of us need to start thinking long-term. And that may not, again, y'all are entering the profession. I don't know what institutions you're going to be in, but whatever institution it is, I am on a mission right now to be there has to be a short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategy. If we only play the short term, we will find ourselves in this position again. That's not a lawyer-only thing. That is a progressive sector. That is a law and organizing thing. But it is a muscle to think in how many of y'all have ever built a 50-year plan or a 100-year plan? I tried. It was really hard. It was really hard because our brains don't work that way, or we're not trained to think in that way. But I think those are the new skills and new muscles that we're going to have to develop in this moment. And it may even be a place to start is with your family. People have to safeguard some things and anticipate threats to your family, financially, or if you're a queer person and you have a kid, what are the ways you're going to safeguard your rights with your child? There are lots of ways that we as a people know how to be prepared. I come from an immigrant family, and I say my parents fought 7 generations in a way that I kind of struggle with, maybe out of privilege of not having to be like a first generation American. But I think we're going to have to all use that muscle a little bit. Last thing on the how. This is not a time for like, we've got the answers as lawyers. Like, this is a time for really deeply, so two things. Being a radical is the same no matter what profession you're in. It is trying to get to the root of problems. And it is like, I think we need that. Like, you need to see yourself in this fight as more than a lawyer. Like, you are a person. We are contending for the future of our world. There are things that are very important to us that we are contending for right now. What is the purpose that drives you to that work? Really nurture that, because it is going to get hairy. It is going to be twists and turns. We're going to have a lot of losses. It's going to be physically hard. It's going to be emotionally hard. And a careerist vision of this is not going to work. You're gonna have to find something deeper that motivates you. So if you need some time to think about that. Talk to each other about that. What really matters to you? What really matters to you? Who really matters to you? Let that be your anchor as you try to figure it out. Second, this is a team sport. This is not a solo thing that we're going to be doing either as a sector or as people. So it is very easy to get discouraged. It's very easy to be scared. It's very easy to be overwhelmed when you think you are responsible for it all. And this is why joining an organization matters. Being a part of political spaces matter. If you aren't a part of something like that, now is the time to join. I don't care which one you join. Join something. Be in a group of organized people that are trying to resist in some way, because you will need that. It will sharpen what you do. You will have people to talk to. You will have people to debrief with. And then my big pitch for lawyers is like, we've got to work with organizers. Organizers live in the terrain of power in a way that we need to actually sit at their feet and listen and learn. And they don't have all the answers either, but it is a time for it's like in the Avengers, and like all the fingers on the hand got to come together. This is not a time for oh, y'all don't get this. And it is a time for we need everybody, and it's all hands on deck. And we need to, if you know how to bridge build in your family, if you were the middle kid or whatever, we need those skills right now. Lawyers are not good collaborators. So if you want to develop it, I won't be take this class. I'll be become a good collaborator. Figure out how to ask good questions. How are you in spaces where your affect is oh, that's some bullshit, and you're just you're muttering under your breath? Or are you asking a question that moves the group forward? Are you in principled debates? Are you not just rote and mechanically in it is hard. It requires an enlivening, a presence, a forward stance is how I think about it. But we all of us have to embody that in some way. And I think that is how we're going to get to a much tighter resistance to this moment.
Wow. I'm thinking about all the things that we could talk about more. And I think about ways that we can, as a law school, really help us train these muscles and start to think about how do we learn how to say those questions. I have more questions for you, but I really, really want to encourage all of you. I don't want to take all the time.
Yeah. So, Purvi, what you said about how the right has sort of developed this narrative that places all the fears and troubles of commonplace Americans in immigrants or people of color, or more marginalized groups, and saying we've got a solution, we'll get rid of them. Yeah, that really resonates with me because I think that's exactly what's happened. And I guess I'm wondering, it just seems like such a thinly veiled attempt to create a boogeyman. And I'm wondering why it's been so effective and what commonplace people and lawyers can do to change that narrative. How do we combat that idea that immigrants are the problem, that people of color are the problem, marginalized groups?
Well, I think the fundamental thing that's happening is that people are hurting. That's the thing that I think we have to understand, is that people are struggling in their lives. So I think you're right, it is a false boogeyman, but it is speaking to pain in a particular way. So I like to humanize how a person might receive it, because I don't think if you can't put yourself in their shoes, I mean, this is not to say there isn't racism and misogyny and a bunch of other things at play, but I think it's swirling together in a lot of ways. You know, I don't know that I can say this is the thing, right? Like, but I think it is being willing to be in conversation, like join a grassroots group and knock on doors, go to meetings. Like, people are gathering in different ways. I think in some ways, like, the polarization of our country is actually making us more isolated, all of us more isolated. And we're not gathering in places to actually really talk about things. And I don't think that's like, I know there's been a lot of talk about, like, this isn't like a both and, like, a, you know, everybody's ideas are about, like, I'm not coming from it from that place, but I think I feel humbled by the loss. And I want to be honest that we need to talk to each other. I believe that part of the way we get out of this is we actually win real things for people's lives. So I don't know that narrative is going to work here. I don't know that this is like, let me tell you why you should think differently about this. When people have housing and good jobs, and democracy is not an elite concept, like, there's been a lot of confusion about, like, why are everyday people not upset about the loss of democracy? Because democracy is not real in people's lives. You're exploited at your job by your landlord. You don't have reproductive rights. Your kids aren't getting a good education. Democracy has to be real. I think we have inverted our point of attention. We're focused on formal democratic rights, and we haven't put as much attention to winning democracy, little d democracy. So I think putting nose to the grindstone and being like, how can we win real, like, LA, social housing, like, there are big things that are happening in different ways. Like, to me, I'm like, speak to people's material needs, and then there's an opportunity to actually work, like, build that bigger we. Like, we have to do that work of suturing communities together. I think when you're in real campaigns and fights, I have found, like, narrating back how our systems are not working, being honest about, like, the counseling role of a lawyer is actually quite powerful. People are coming to you in the hardest moment of their lives, and they're looking for help. We have an ethical responsibility in which we're not trying to move people towards a particular solution to their problems, right? Especially if you're in some kind of litigation. But I think we sometimes leave a lot on the table in terms of how we can narrate how systems are actually designed to not work for our people. So I think engage, like, get into the conversations with people, try to understand and have humility and curiosity about why they might be feeling the way they are, and then fight like hell to make some of those real, like, material things happen in people's lives. That's going to be harder in this terrain. I'm not saying it's easy. I also don't think it's monochromatic. I don't think it's like all is lost, nothing can be won. So y'all are in California. There are things that can keep going and ways that we can keep speaking to people's needs. I'm not a comms genius. That's not my lane. Like, I don't do work in that arena. I'm sure those people would have other really insightful things to say as well. But that's how I see it. I'm like, if we can build movements and we can actually provide for people's material needs, and then we can also be not arrogant about welcoming them back in, I think that is going to be the path forward in some ways. Other questions?
So I come from, like, a community organizing background, so a lot of the things you're saying, like, really resonated with me. But also going into law school, I know that organizers and lawyers have, like, different roles in the movement, and you were saying that the right has been, like, out-organizing us. So I think I'm curious, like, what do you think it means for, like, lawyers in particular, like, to be organized?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is like a bit of an evergreen debate between my movement lawyer friends. I think there's a growing trend of people that are like, it's a false divide, lawyer and organizer. I might be like a tad more old school because I was trained by, like, old school community lawyers. And I think my experience is, like, it's not possible to do, like, organizing is an art and a tradition, and it is rich, and it has, like, a lot of steps and rigor to it. I think sometimes like with the Obama, like everybody's a community organizer thing, I think we've somehow, I think also, I don't want to cheapen what organizing is. So can you have an activist and organizing stance as a lawyer? Hell yeah. Like I do that every day. Is it not as black and white as we would say, like, oh, organizers only do this and lawyers only, anybody, like I teach the 1.0 on movement lawyering. I start there because I want to have people have real humility for organizing. The 2.0 is, it's a dynamic relationship. The more accountable you are to movements, the more trust you get, the more opportunities you have to be like, this is my idea. This is what I think. Here's an opportunity. Here's a place. So I think to me, it's like be in right relationship. And y'all know what right relationship is, right? You know what it's like to be in right relationship with someone where you feel respected. You feel like they feel like you see their dignity. You believe that the way that they have talent and genius. A lot of lawyers are not in right relationship with organizers. And that's where it's like, take 1,000 seats. But if you are in a place in which, like, to me, I'm like, the divides are important for discipline, but they are not essential. They are not like an essential identity. I'm not like a lawyer in my bones, like through and through. But being very clear about the role you're playing. We also have a skill that nobody else can do. They can't go into the court and do things, or they can't do certain things that we can do. So to me, it's like a right relationship and also a division of labor. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is, like, I think this idea of contending, like getting out organized in law is also because I don't think movement has absorbed law into their terrain. Narrative has been, if you've seen over the years, like culture, narrative, we've said that's a terrain we need to struggle on. I am in a big push with a lot of movement colleagues to be like, the future of law should be determined by our movements. It's not a legal question, right? We're going to have a constitutional convention at some point being, ALEC and the right has been moving towards the possibility of a constitutional convention. To me, the strategy there is not going to be like a bunch of lawyers have ideas about what the Constitution should look like. The idea is that people are engaged in that process, right? And I think I will say that I'm like still a little fuzzy on what that looks like, right? I've been looking at Chile and the constitutional reform process there, what worked, what didn't work. Like, I don't know how you have mass, like what is the right way? You know, in Chile, both the left and the right agenda didn't work for constitutional reform. So I don't know that I like know how, but like to me, I'm like, that's just one example. But to me, it's like, these are all terrains of struggle. And people who are trying to build power have to see law. It is not the water we're swimming in, it is a chessboard. So what is our move on the chessboard? That's a collaboration between lawyers and movement strategists.
Oh, lots of questions. Was there hands over here? Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate you coming out. And I